Hey everyone, this is Pete, and today I'd like to talk about Haunted House from Atari. No, not that one. Or that one. Or that one. Or that one. Nope, Atari have gone and made Haunted House for a fifth time, this time in collaboration with Brazilian developer Orbit Studio, whose previous work includes the well-received Asimov-inspired isometric puzzle adventure Retro Machina. For the unfamiliar, the original Haunted House is regarded by some as the original survival horror game, in that it casts you in the role of an unarmed, vulnerable protagonist with a limited ability to carry items, tasked with exploring a substantial map and solving puzzles while keeping yourself safe from powerful enemies that it's difficult to fight back against. While the original may seem very simplistic to modern gamers, it includes a number of features that were notable innovations at the time of its original release in 1982. For example, it was an early game that featured player-controlled scrolling, as the map of the titular haunted house was bigger than a single screen. Rather than simply flicking from one screen to another, the virtual camera would follow the player's avatar as they explored. It was also an early game to explore the concept of lighting and its effects on a game like this. Items and some enemies can only be seen while the player character has a match lit, for example, but the light from the match also attracts enemies. On top of that, harder difficulty levels black out the mansion's walls and doors, meaning you have to feel your way around, or use the shadows that appear in the light of the match to figure out where you are. It also built on the concepts established in Atari's earlier title Adventure by allowing the player character to carry a single item at once. These items are always useful in specific circumstances, but the fact you can only carry one at once means you often have to strategically drop things in specific places to make progress. This can be especially challenging, considering that the broken urn which forms the game's main objective counts as one of these objects. Part of the challenge on the higher difficulty levels is figuring out a suitable path back to the mansion's entrance hall that allows you to bypass obstacles such as locked doors which require you to be carrying a specific item. The original Haunted House is a good Atari 2600 game, but attempts to reboot it over the years have met with varying degrees of success. A 2010 version for Xbox 360 and Nintendo Wii had a tepid reception thanks to being considered too much of a slavish remake of the original mechanics, which were seen as outdated. A 2014 first-person horror game was poorly received for a variety of reasons. And Digital Eclipse's voxel-based reimagining as part of the fantastic Atari 50 compilation was widely praised for combining a respectful sense of authenticity to the original with modern conveniences and technological improvements. So what of this new version then? Well, among other things, it once again retroactively changes the backstory of the game. While in the original Haunted House, the concept was that the titular house was haunted by the spirit of a character known as Zachary Graves, in this new version you play Lynn, the niece of Zachary Graves, who is supposedly still very much alive. Lynn has come to her uncle's mansion after hearing that he has mysteriously disappeared, and that the last place he was seen was in his own home. She brings her friends along to the mansion, as you do in any vaguely horror-inspired scenario, and of course they all get kidnapped by ghouls and ghosts, leaving Lynn all on her own to figure things out. Actually, that's not quite true. In short order, she encounters the imaginatively named ghost Spooky, who proceeds to take her through the obligatory 21st century game tutorial, introducing you to the various challenges you might encounter during your exploration of the mansion. Thankfully, while it would be nice to have the option to skip this and discover the various game elements a little more organically through standard play, it doesn't take too long to get through and serves as a decent introduction to the game for newcomers or less confident players. As in the original Haunted House, Lynn's objective in the new game is to locate 3 pieces of a mystical urn. Instead of being scattered randomly though, they're guarded by bosses in 3 distinct areas of the house. In order to reach each boss, Lynn will need to work her way through a series of rooms, completing some sort of challenge in each one in order to remove the curses from the doors and allow her to proceed. These challenges take several forms. Sometimes she'll be required to eliminate a series of enemies from a room. At other times, she'll have to destroy ghostly chains preventing the doors from opening. And occasionally, she'll have to delve into the ghostly realm, a trap-filled area that she has to traverse safely in order to return to reality and open the way forward. In each room, you'll find treasure chests. Sometimes these contain gold and gems, while on other occasions they'll contain usable items. Food allows Lynn to restore her health, while traps can be used on the mansion's ghostly and ghoulish denizens in various ways to give Lynn an advantage at combat. Yes, Lynn can actually fight back in Haunted House, though this isn't a combat-centric game by any means. In fact, it's a stealth-centric game, in which by far the most effective means of defeating enemies is sneaking up on them unawares and performing an instant kill maneuver on them. The alternative is using Lynn's lantern to gradually suck the energy from her foes, a slow process that is inadvisable to attempt without incapacitating or at least distracting them first. No, instead it's much better to keep out of sight as much as possible, because once an enemy is aware of your position, it's very difficult to shake them off, particularly in the mansion's smaller rooms. It's not impossible. If you keep out of their reach for long enough, they'll eventually give up the chase, but it's generally best not to get spotted in the first place. To that end, you have a few helpful tools at your disposal. Firstly, all the enemies have a visible vision cone on screen, which allows you to determine whether or not it's safe to try and slip past them. These enemies often move or at least look around on spottable patterns, so dealing with them is a matter of observing them and finding a suitable opportunity to get past them, or, ideally, defeat them. Secondly, the amount of noise Lynn is making is visualised in two ways: a sound meter in the corner of the screen, and visible sound waves that ripple outward from anything Lynn does that makes a noise. This includes knocking over tables and smashing objects, so careful movement is a must if you're trying to stay unnoticed. Thirdly, some of the items Lynn can find in the treasure chests allow her to reduce the amount of noise she makes, or even disguise herself as a ghost, making her able to walk openly in front of enemies without being attacked for a short period. And fourthly, the trap items Lynn can acquire allow her to stun ghosts, provoke them into attacking an inflatable object, cause them to flee in fear, or freeze them temporarily. Understanding how each of these items works and how best to use them is essential to success. If the worst comes to the worst, Lynn has a couple of moves she can use in an attempt to escape trouble. First is the simple ability to run, which is noisy and rapidly depletes her stamina, but which can put some decent distance between her and an enemy. Second is the obligatory dodge roll with invincibility frames, which can be used to get out of the way of enemies and pass through traps unscathed. This latter aspect is essential to master, particularly in the rooms that task you with surviving against an increasingly large number of enemies for a full minute. You don't need to defeat them, you just need to not run out of health in that period. If Lynn does get defeated, Spooky brings her back to the mansion's entrance, where she has the opportunity to do a few things. Most notably, she has the opportunity to spend accumulated gems on upgrading her basic abilities in various ways. She can increase her base health and stamina, or upgrade the power of her lantern, and even improve her stealthiness. Yes, we're firmly in roguelite territory here, where the longer you play, the easier you can make the game for yourself through these upgrades. Though make no mistake, Haunted House still presents a reasonable challenge by de-emphasising combat and focusing on stealth. There are also various collectibles you can acquire throughout the game, including Atari cartridges and memorabilia, which can be presented to a character in the lobby. Other collectibles, including lost cats and kitchen utensils, can be given to the characters seeking them if they happen to appear in a special room during a run through the mansion. And as you progress through the game, you'll unlock access to some extra dungeons in the mansion's basement, which present their own distinct challenges to overcome. You'll also unlock Lynn's friends as playable characters as you rescue them, providing some variety for subsequent replays due to their varying starting abilities. There's a fundamentally good game here. Sure, it's yet another example of a procedurally generated game with roguelike elements, and we're not exactly short of those these days. But Haunted House provides enough tweaks to the usual formula to make it interesting. The stealth-based focus is probably its standout feature, and while there are a few occasions where this feels a little clumsy, most notably when it comes to reliably escaping enemies that are chasing you, this definitely gives Haunted House a unique selling point that sets it apart from the myriad other games of this type. The presentation is nice too, with the overall aesthetic feeling rather reminiscent of PC games from the mid-90s. The combination of the detail-packed isometric perspective and the orchestral battle music when confronting the ghouls and ghosts gave me strong Infinity Engine vibes in particular, with the game's main nod to 21st century tech being that all the characters are 3D models rather than sprites. and 3D models that blend in admirably well with the somewhat painterly backdrops, it has to be said. The one thing that's a bit of a shame is that the game was released with a few glaring bugs that should have been fixed prior to launch. The most egregious of these is that the in-game map feature completely stops working after making a single run through the mansion, though it does seem to come back temporarily if you attempt a different area, such as one of the basement dungeons, and then return to the main quest. There are also numerous textual errors in the game, most notably the fact that some item names in the inventory screen don't match what they're called either in the pop-up tips that appear when you find an item on the floor, or the caption that appears when you select them in the interface's hotbar. One item is misspelled Berserk when you collect it, it's correctly called Berserk in the toolbar, and described as balloon in the inventory screen, for example. The latter isn't necessarily inaccurate since it does summon a balloon that causes enemies to go berserk, but the inconsistency is a bit of a problem. To be honest, since there are only a few different item types, once you learn what everything does, this falls more into the category of charming jank that is likely the result of translation issues than game-breaking bug, but it should still probably have been caught prior to release. Now, I don't doubt that these issues, along with any others I haven't noticed, will be patched out of Haunted House in short order, and may even have already been fixed by the time you watch this video. It's also worth noting that the majority of my comments here are based on the Switch version, which you've been watching footage from. And out of curiosity, a desire to be thorough, and the fact that they actually rather like this game, I decided to double dip on the PC version to see if they were still present in that release of the game. Interestingly, they seemingly were not, so it appears to be a case of a crappy Switch port more than anything, but it's still a bit of a sad indictment of modern gaming that a company such as Atari can release a new take on one of its most recognisable properties with some absolutely glaring issues such as this, regardless of whether they're confined to specific platforms. Granted, neither of the problems I've mentioned completely break the game, make it in any way unplayable or cause crashes, but they're still fairly fundamental, noticeable things that should have been caught. Don't let those things put you off Haunted House though, particularly if you intend playing on PC. Underneath a few janky elements, there's a solid game here. The roguelite structure, while rather oversaturated in the market today, is immensely popular for good reason. It provides plenty of longevity and variety, and makes for a game that you can come back to time and time again, always feeling like you're making gradual progress. And Haunted House's focus on stealth, rather than all-out combat, gives it enough distinctiveness to stand out in this crowded field. There's honestly not a lot that directly connects it to the classic 2600 version of Haunted House, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. We already have a solid reimagining of that in the form of Digital Eclipse's Haunted Houses in Atari 50. Instead, what we've ended up with here is a decent game that stands up perfectly well on its own merits, rather than using brand recognition as a crutch to prop itself up. This is a good example of how to successfully reimagine and reboot a classic property without simply slavishly remaking it. And honestly, I'd be well up for seeing Atari attempt a similar approach with some of its other classic properties, such as Adventure. For now though, it just remains for me to say, as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.